So today we're talking about voter registration, specifically the case for automatic voter registration and other reforms to make voting easier. Why do we have to register to vote in the first place? If we all become eligible when we turn 18, why isn't it automatic? On any given election day, people show up to the polls to vote only to find out that they aren't registered, or if they live in a place like New York and wanted to change their political party, they would have had to have that change of heart a year before in order to do so for the election. So if we make the registration process an opt-out process instead of an opt-in, we could add 50 million people to the voter rolls. States could save thousands, if not millions of dollars, and it would actually increase the ease and accuracy of voting. Here to talk to me about this and more is Susan Lerner, the executive director of Common Cause New York. Susan joined Common Cause in 2007, and before that, she was the executive director of the California Clean Money Campaign. Susan, welcome to Sunday Civics.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So, Susan, part of Common Cause's work is to modernize voter registration systems so that voters can, maybe register online or make sure that registration is automatic. What's in our way from making that happen?
Well, a couple of things. Antiquated systems and bad attitudes on the part of some of our elected officials who don't understand what a barrier to exercising the franchise antiquated registration procedures can be. You know, a lot of people say, oh, I didn't find it hard to register. I don't understand why there's a problem. But the truth of the matter is that if you actually push a little bit, then you might find that somebody said, oh, I never had a problem, has a sister-in-law or a friend who forgot to register when they moved and weren't able to vote. So it's actually a pervasive problem that hits all communities, and it's particularly a problem in communities of color and communities that have traditionally been marginalized, where people don't have as much control over their schedules and find it harder to complete what is, frankly, sometimes very confusing paperwork.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, we're doing the process for the resources part of our show of going to each state's website to find out what the laws are, the procedures for registering and voting. And even on the individual websites, it's a lot of text. It can be confusing. Do I need ID to register or only to vote? And then what type of ID? And then how long do I have to register in advance before Election Day? What is the case against automatic voter registration or even registration the same day as Election Day?
Well, some people are frightened that there would be a security issue, that people who are ineligible, these fictional millions of uneligible voters who the current president says, constantly vote. These allegations we hear about busloads of people coming from one state to another to fraudulently vote. And, these are all myths. It's simply not anything which has ever happened. And there really have not been substantial problems. In fact, what we've seen, amazingly and ironically enough, is when there are problems with people trying to fraudulently register, they tend to be people who are trying to show the system's broken, who then get caught for trying to vote twice or to fraudulently register. So security is the excuse that's used. But in actuality, what we've seen is an automatic voter registration system properly set up is actually more secure than our current registration system and really helps to be sure that eligible voters are actually on the voter rolls, and voter rolls that are much more accurate and what database people call cleaner.
Now, but is there some complications with that when you're talking about, because remember, for those of you who are listening, there is no central database of registered voters. This is part of the reason, when we talked about on a previous show, why so many states, both Republican-led and Democrat-led, were in opposition to the request from the current administration to send their voter registration list, because there doesn't exist this centralized database. So we're talking about each state developing their own process, are we not, Susan?
We are, but we already have that requirement in the Help America Vote Act. Every state is required to have a database of registered voters. And some states have set up communications between them among them in order to ensure that when somebody moves from one state to another, that they're appropriately removed off their former state's voter rolls and properly placed on their current state's voter rolls. So there are correct ways to do this. The problem is that we have some forces who are currently allied with the current federal administration who actually want to use the process of being sure our voter rolls are accurate to improperly remove people. So we have to be very vigilant.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the removal process and how that would intersect with automatic voter registration. Because when we talk, well, let's step back a second. If we're talking about automatic voter registration, we're saying when you become eligible, which is turning 18, you are automatically registered to vote.
Well, there are two different ways to do it.
Sure.
Okay. Here in the United States, right now, the way in which automatic voter registration is rolling out in various states is that it isn't what you're talking about, which is you turn 18 and automatically you're on the voter rolls. The way in which it's actually been implemented is when you interact with state government, then you go on the voter rolls. And that's when it becomes an opt-out situation. Okay. So your listeners might be familiar with the situation when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and you've moved into the state or you've moved addresses. In many states, because of the motor voter rule at the federal level, the Department of Motor Vehicles is required to say to you, do you want to change your voter registration?
Right.
That's called an opt-in system. What's really interesting, and it's fascinating that the state of Georgia implemented this, because we don't always think of them as being very forward-thinking in Georgia, is that Georgia made a really significant increase to the eligible voters on its voter rolls by changing its DMV form from an opt-in to an opt-out. So you go and you interact with the Georgia Department of Motor Vehicles. They have all of the information that you need to be on the voter rolls. And unless you tell them, nah, I don't want you to do that, then you're automatically on the voter rolls. That increased the number of registered voters in Georgia by hundreds of thousands.
And most people, I can think of 18-year-olds or even younger, when you're eligible to get a learner's permit, or getting your driver's license in a that's the current, the American trope, right? You, as soon as you can, you want to learn how to drive and get your license so you can get up out of your parents' house whenever you feel like it, right? So we will already, from lots of young people having learner's permits, they're basically pre-registered to vote at that point.
That's right. Now, of course, the limitation on the Department of Motor Vehicles as your point of contact is that, yes, there are a lot of Americans, and I was certainly one the moment I was 16, 7 o'clock in the morning, I was like, okay, Mom, let's go. Let's get me the learner's permit. But if you live in a large city, you may not have that desire. You may not have access to a car. So what we're working to do is to be sure that automatic voter registration expands beyond the DMV, because there are a lot of state agencies that people interact with that could be used to automatically register them. So the state of Alaska is a really interesting example for that, okay? Your listeners may or may not be aware that in Alaska, every resident of Alaska registers in order to receive his or her share of the royalties from oil and gas that the state collects. They actually get checks. So the initiative in Alaska to set up automatic voter registration used signing up for your oil and gas royalty check as the way in which to automatically register you to vote.
So it's basically identifying what city, state agencies or federal agencies people interact with on a regular basis, and then using that information. So you could say use Social Security, or you could use public housing if for people that are in the public housing, or maybe get any type of social services.
That's exactly right. The social services is an excellent place in which we could use automatic voter registration. There are just so many different ways in which people interact with their state government, and we want it to be our state government because that's where voter registration happens. And it's just a question of setting up the system and being sure that the accurate records are transmitted to the Board of Elections.
Well, this seems like an opportunity, as we say on this show, to bring about what type of civic action can an individual take in order to help advance this issue. So what can the individual listener take from this conversation, Susan, and use it to take civic action in their state?
So, this is a question of talking to your elected representatives. There are 10 states in the District of Columbia right now which have automatic voter registration. So they have it in Washington State, they have it in Alaska, they have it in Rhode Island, they have it in Illinois. So first thing to do is to check and see if your state has it. And then it's get in touch with your state representatives and your governor and say, this is a no-brainer. This is absolutely a way to ensure that eligible voters have an opportunity to vote and that our voter rolls are secure and accurate. And, it's really interesting when Washington State set up its automatic voter registration. They added close to 1 million people to the voter rolls right away. And the point of contact there was the Department of Motor Vehicles, because on the West Coast, most people drive. What was really interesting is that of the people who were automatically registered, 40% of those people then voted in the next election.
Wow.
So you really have a substantial impact, and it's really not that complicated to set up correctly. It's something that every state should be doing. And the message to eligible citizens is your government wants you to participate. And the best way to get people involved is to ask them to be involved.
Yeah, we talk about a study that Pew Research Center put out about a year or two ago, in saying that over 60% of people said they had never even been asked, whether by a family member, a government entity, an agency, their church or other, they had never asked them to register to vote. Did you find that surprising when you read that?
No, I didn't find that surprising at all, because our system here in the United States, to me, is backwards. It puts all of the emphasis on the individual has to figure it out and initiate everything. In countries where that is flipped, where it's the government's responsibility to be sure that citizens have access and are able to vote. In Canada, for instance, they invite you to register. They have much higher registration rates. They have much higher participation rates.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for joining us for this conversation. And remember, folks, those of you who are listening, this is your second Take Civic Action for today, to write your legislature, to talk to your governor or send a letter to your governor, because we know letters get responses, to ask them about implementing automatic voter registration in your state.